The dark brown fur coat, heavy with the scent of pine and frozen earth, was the only thing Jedediah Stone truly owned. It was his shelter on the mountain, his bedroll under the stars, and the one piece of his past that still fit. But the seam along the left shoulder, where a cornered catamount had gotten the better of him, was now a gaping wound. Cold had a way of finding such weaknesses. Jedediah, a man built on the scale of the mountains he called home, could feel the winter's teeth right through to his bones. For the first time in 5 years, his solitude had failed him. He had to go to town. His name was Jedediah Stone, though no one in Prospect's Gulch had used it in years. To them, he was just the mountain man, a figure who appeared twice a year to trade perfectly tanned pelts for salt, flour, and steel traps. He was immense, with a tangle of dark hair and a beard that fell to his chest, and hands that could split an oak log with a single swing of his axe. He was a creature of silence and shadow, and the town's widows, with their hopeful casseroles and neatly hemmed curtains, saw him as a project. They saw the broad shoulders and the lonely cabin, and imagined him tamed, washed, and seated at the head of a dinner table. Jedediah saw their polite, grasping hands, and retreated further into the granite heart of the Rockies. He had rejected every one of them, not with cruelty, but with an impenetrable quiet that was far more effective. Now, in the brutal heart of the winter of 1881, that quiet was no longer enough. Prospect's Gulch, nestled in a high Colorado valley, was a place governed by two things: the price of silver and the suffocating weight of snow. The social pressure was a quiet, constant thing. A man on his own was a curiosity. A man who actively chose it was a threat to the natural order. As he walked his furs into the general store, the familiar silence fell. Men stopped talking. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson, simply nodded, his eyes going from Jedediah's face to the torn coat. Jedediah didn't need to speak. The rip spoke for him. He needed a seamstress, and that meant dealing with the very society he had spent years avoiding. The problem was, a mended coat would cost him more than just coin. It would cost him a conversation, an obligation. And he was about to discover the only person in town willing to fix it was someone Prospect's Gulch had already decided wasn't worth speaking to at all. Henderson wiped his hands on his apron, his gaze flicking toward the back of the store. "Mrs. Gable is bespoke for a week, Jedediah. Wedding dress for the mayor's daughter." He paused, chewing on his lip. "There's another option. The Chinese girl who works the laundry, Mei Lin. She does mending work for the miners on the east side." The east side was a collection of rough-hewn shacks and tents where the Chinese laborers lived, separated from the rest of the gulch by more than just a muddy street. Jedediah just grunted. He didn't care who stitched the coat, as long as the stitches held. He gathered his pelts, traded them for his necessities, and left the store. The laundry was a small, clapboard building with steam fogging the single window. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of lye soap and hot water. A young woman stood over a large wooden tub, her back to the door. She wore a faded, light blue prairie dress, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. When she turned, Jedediah saw she was hardly more than a girl, maybe 20 years old, with a face framed by straight black hair pulled back neatly. Her hands, though reddened from the hot water, moved with a deliberate grace. She looked up at him, and her eyes, dark and intelligent, showed no fear, only a quiet assessment. This was unusual. Most people in the gulch flinched, at least a little, when confronted with his sheer size. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft, her English precise. Jedediah found himself fumbling with the coat, feeling foolishly large in the small, warm room. He held it out. "It's torn. Henderson said you mend things." She took the heavy garment from him, her small hands surprisingly strong as she managed its weight. She laid it on a clean table and ran her fingers along the torn seam. "The hide is thick. My needle might break." "I can pay," he said, the words feeling rough in his throat. "It is not a question of payment," she said, still examining the fur. "It is a question of the right tool. I have needles for canvas, for denim. This is like leather." She looked up at him. "I will need a glover's needle, an awl, perhaps. Mr. Henderson may have one." He was about to turn and leave, to go back to the store, but something in her focus held him. She wasn't dismissing him. She was solving the problem. Therefore, he stood his ground, waiting. She seemed to notice his stillness and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I will try with what I have first. If it does not work, then you can go. Leave it here. Come back before sundown." Jedediah wasn't used to being given instructions, but her quiet authority felt less like a command and more like a simple statement of fact. He nodded once and left the coat, stepping back out into the biting cold, feeling strangely lighter. But as he walked down the main street, he saw a knot of men standing outside the saloon. One of them, Silas Croft, the owner of the richest silver claim in the territory, watched him pass. Croft was a man whose smiles never reached his eyes. He was always dressed in a fine wool suit, even in the mud of the gulch, a stark contrast to the miners he employed. He said something to the men with him, and they all laughed, their eyes following Jedediah. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't meant to be shared. Jedediah ignored it. Town problems were not his problems. He had what he needed, and a promise of a mended coat. He would get a drink at the other end of town and wait. The sky, however, had other plans. The wind picked up, carrying with it not just cold, but the stinging bite of ice crystals. The air grew thick and gray. A blizzard was coming, and it was coming fast. Within an hour, Prospect's Gulch was swallowed by a swirling wall of white. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Leaving town was now impossible. Jedediah was trapped. He found himself back at the laundry, the wind howling at his back, pushing him toward the one warm, lit window in the storm. He knocked, the sound swallowed by the gale. The door opened the crack, and Maylin peered out. She saw him, a massive figure covered in a layer of snow, and opened the door wider. "The storm came quickly," she said, stating the obvious. "My coat," he managed to say, his beard stiff with ice. "It is not finished." She stepped back, allowing him into the small space. The front room was the laundry. A curtain separated it from a smaller room in the back, which was clearly her living quarters. A small stove glowed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the cold seeping through the walls. His coat was spread on her table, and beside it lay a small tin box containing her sewing supplies. She had managed to stitch a few inches, the thread thick and waxed, the stitches small and incredibly neat. "The needle is too weak," she said. "It broke." She held up the tiny, snapped piece of steel. Jedediah looked from the broken needle to the raging storm outside. He was stuck, not just in town, but in this small room with this quiet girl. The carefully constructed walls of his solitude were being battered down by a force of nature. But the physical crisis of the storm was quickly overshadowed by a human one. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched on the porch, followed by a loud banging on the door that was nothing like Jedediah's knock. It was a summons. Maylin's face, which had been calm, became a mask of stillness. She didn't move toward the door. "Open up, girl!" a voice boomed from outside. "Mr. Croft wants a word." Jedediah looked at Maylin. The calm composure was still there, but he could see the tension in her hands, which she had clasped tightly in front of her. She was outmatched. In Prospect's Gulch, Silas Croft's word was law, and she was a lone Chinese woman with no standing, no family, and no protection. Jedediah was just a customer, a stranger. His business was with the coat, nothing more. He could step into the shadows of the back room and let her handle her own affairs. It was the smart thing to do. It was the mountain man's way. But he didn't move. He watched her. She took a slow breath, then walked to the door and opened it. Two of Croft's men stood there, big, rough miners, their shoulders dusted with snow. Behind them, Silas Croft himself waited, protected from the worst of the wind by the overhang of the roof. "Maylin," Croft said, his voice smooth and cold as river ice, "my laundry was not delivered on time today." "The storm, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even. "I could not see to cross the street." "An inconvenience," Croft said, stepping forward so his polished boots were on her doorstep. "I am a man who values punctuality. It speaks to character. A lack of it suggests other failings, perhaps carelessness, perhaps dishonesty." His eyes scanned the room and settled on Jedediah. Croft's polite smile widened. "Well, look at this. It seems you have company. I was not aware you entertained, Maylin." The implication was ugly and immediate. The community, or what passed for it on this street, was witnessing this confrontation. The men were judging. Jedediah felt the weight of their stares. He was being measured, placed into a story that was not his own. He was a man who avoided notice, who valued his anonymity above all else. Intervening would mean making an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley. It would mean trouble, the one thing he had organized his entire life to avoid. Therefore, he took a step forward, out of the shadows and into the lamplight. He didn't say a word. He simply moved to stand slightly behind Maylin, his sheer size filling the doorway, a silent, unmovable presence. The two miners shifted their weight, suddenly looking less confident. Croft's eyes narrowed. He had not expected this. He had expected a frightened girl he could easily intimidate. Instead, he found her flanked by a grizzly bear of a man. "This is not your concern, Stone," Croft said, his politeness fraying. For the first time, Jedediah spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small room. "Her needle broke, mending my coat." He held up the garment showing the unfinished seam. She was waiting for the storm to pass to get a new one from the store. It was a simple statement of fact, but it completely dismantled Croft's insinuation. It gave her a reason for his presence that was practical, public, and devoid of any of the filth Croft had tried to attach to it. It was a move of unexpected competence. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't postured. He had simply presented the truth. Maylin revealed her own surprising quality then. She didn't shrink behind Jedediah's protection. She stepped slightly to the side, so she was standing with him, not behind him. "Your laundry will be ready in the morning, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You will not be charged for the delay." She was not asking for permission. She was informing him of the terms. The community, Croft's two brutes, witnessed the reversal. The social judgment began to shift. The girl wasn't just a victim. The mountain man wasn't just a savage. Croft stared at them for a long moment, his face a thundercloud of barely controlled fury. He was a man used to being obeyed, to having his power reflected back at him in the fear of others. He was getting none of that here. With a final, venomous glare, he turned on his heel and stalked off into the blizzard, his men trailing behind him like curs. The immediate conflict was over. Maylin quietly closed the door, shutting out the storm. The little room felt immensely silent. She turned to Jedediah, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said. It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of a debt she knew she might not be able to repay. Jedediah just nodded, feeling the familiar urge to retreat, to disappear back into the wild. The surface problem, a delayed delivery of laundry, was resolved. But as he looked at the resolute set of her jaw, he understood that this was not the end of it. Silas Croft was not a man who forgot a public slight. Jedediah had interfered. He had chosen a side. He was about to find out that a torn coat and a sudden blizzard were the least of his troubles. The storm raged for 2 days, burying Prospect's Gulch under a thick blanket of silence and snow. For Jedediah, the laundry became a small, temporary world. He slept on a pile of furs he'd brought in from his pack, near the stove, while Maylin kept to her small, curtained-off room. They existed in a quiet space, marked by the hiss of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the rhythmic scrape of Maylin's new needle against the thick hide of his coat. Henderson, the storekeeper, had braved the storm to bring her a glover's needle and a small bag of groceries, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes in the silent language of the town. On the second night, the wind finally died down. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the occasional crackle from the stove. They sat at the small table, sharing a bowl of rice and dried meat. It was the most time Jedediah had spent in the company of another human being in 5 years. He watched her hands as she worked on his coat. The stitches she made were impossibly small and even, a line of perfect discipline against the wildness of the fur. "Why do you stay here?" he asked, the question surprising him as much as it did her. She didn't look up from her work. "Where would I go?" she answered, her voice soft. "The railroad is finished. The mining camps move. This place has work." "It has men like Croft," he said, his voice a low grumble. Her hands stilled for a moment. Then she resumed her sewing. "Every place has men like Mr. Croft," she said. "He is not special." There was a finality in her tone that suggested a long and difficult history. Jedediah fell silent, watching the lamplight catch the smooth, dark wood of a small object on her work table. It was a bird, carved with exquisite detail, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He had noticed it before, a piece of delicate beauty in a room defined by hard labor. "Your father made that?" he asked, guessing. She looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Yes. How did you know?" "My own father worked wood," he said. "You can see the man in the knife marks." A small, sad smile touched her lips. She picked up the bird, her fingers tracing its wings. The object seemed to carry an immense emotional weight. "He carved it for me on the ship coming here. He said it was a swallow, that they always find their way home, no matter how far they fly." She set it down gently. "He believed that. He believed in the promise of this country. He worked for the railroad, laying track through mountains colder than this one. When it was done, the company man paid him half of what was promised, not in cash, but in script that was only good at the company store." She paused, taking a breath. This was a private history, a story not meant for the likes of Prospect's Gulch. "He came here to work for Mr. Croft's mine. He was promised fair wages. Mr. Croft knew he was a good worker. But after 3 months, there was an accident. A small one. My father hurt his hand. Mr. Croft said he could no longer work efficiently. He fired him and refused to pay him for his time. He said the cost of his lodging in the camp canceled out his wages." Her voice was flat, stripped of emotion, which only made the words more powerful. "My father argued. He had a ledger. He had kept track of every hour, every day. Mr. Croft took the ledger. He said it was company property. 2 days later, my father was dead. They said he fell into the gulch. They said it was dark, that he must have slipped." Everything became clear. the quiet defiance, the unbreakable composure in the face of Croft's threats. It wasn't just about laundry. It was about a debt of blood. This honest, terrible story reframed everything Jedediah had assumed about her. She wasn't just a victim surviving. She was a witness, waiting. "I am sorry," he said. The words were inadequate, stones dropped into a well of grief. "He was a good man," she said, her gaze returning to the coat. "He deserved better." She tied off a thread, her work finished. "Your coat is mended. The seam will hold against any storm." Just as she spoke, the fragile peace of the night was shattered. The back door of the laundry splintered inwards, kicked open with a single violent blow. 2 of Croft's men filled the space, their faces grim in the lantern light. This was not a public confrontation on a doorstep. This was different. This was violence coming into a private space. "Mr. Croft is tired of waiting for his property," the first man said. He wasn't looking at the laundry. He was looking at Maylin. "And he's decided you're part of it." The second man held up a piece of paper. "A debt contract, signed by your father. Says all he owned and all his family owed passes to Mr. Croft upon his death. It's legal." It was a lie, a piece of paper forged to give a veneer of law to an act of pure evil. But in a territory with the nearest marshal a week's ride away, a piece of paper and 2 armed men were often enough. The danger was real and immediate. Jedediah felt a cold rage settle in his chest. He had spent his life avoiding the ugliness of the world, but the world had just kicked his door down. He could leave. He could grab his coat and walk out the front door. They weren't there for him. His involvement would cost him everything. He would be a wanted man, hunted by Croft's hired guns. His quiet life on the mountain would be over. He would be dragged into a fight that was not his. He looked at Maylin. She was standing, her small sewing scissors clutched in her hand, the only weapon she had. She was terrified, but she was not broken. She was looking at him, not with a plea for rescue, but with the steady gaze of an equal. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of a man he had almost forgotten he could be. He made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, Jedediah rose to his full height. He seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He picked up his newly mended coat, and instead of putting it on, he draped it carefully over Maylin's shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, a shield of fur and leather. Then he turned to face the 2 men. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were weapons enough. "Get out," he said. The words were not a request. They were a command, backed by the certainty of absolute violence. The men hesitated. They had come for a girl. They had not come for this. They looked at each other, then at the silent, immense figure blocking their path. They saw the promise of broken bones and a world of pain in his eyes. They took a step back, then another, and then they were gone, melting back into the night. Jedediah bolted the ruined door as best he could. The room was cold now, the night air pouring in. He turned back to Maylin. She stood unmoving, wrapped in his coat, her face pale. The danger had passed for the moment, but they both knew this was only the beginning. He had made a choice that had cost him his peace, his solitude, his carefully guarded invisibility. He had stepped out of the wilderness and into the world of men, and he couldn't go back. By the following spring, the snows had retreated up the high peaks, and the valley was alive with the rush of meltwater. Prospect's Gulch had changed. Jedediah Stone was no longer just the mountain man. He was now a permanent, if quiet, fixture on the edge of town. He had built a lean-to against the back of the laundry, reinforcing its walls and patching the roof. He didn't live in town, not really, but he was no longer entirely of the mountain either. Their partnership had become the new rhythm of their lives. He would spend weeks in the high country, trapping, and return not to the general store, but to Maylin. He taught her how to read the tracks of deer and rabbit in the soft earth at the edge of the woods, and how to set a snare that was both quick and humane. In return, she showed him how to use the herbs that grew along the creek to preserve meat, a skill that stretched his supplies for months. She took his furs to the territorial traders who passed through, her quiet patience and sharp mind earning them prices Henderson, with his easy credit and town gossip, could never match. By November, they had sold enough pelts to the Fort Laramie garrison to put a deposit on the laundry building itself, her name written on the deed right next to his. It was a legal document, witnessed by the preacher, that gave them both a stake in the future. Silas Croft was gone. His attempt to seize Maylin had been the final overreach. After his men had fled, the town's preacher, a man with a quiet conscience, had made the long ride to Denver and sent a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal's office. The investigation into Croft's business practices had been swift and damning. The debt contract he'd brandished was a clumsy forgery, and Maylin, with jetted eyes standing silently beside her, had produced the one thing Croft thought he had destroyed, her father's real ledger. She had made a copy years ago and hidden it away. It detailed every hour worked, every wage promised, and every lie told. Faced with federal charges, Croft had vanished, his claims seized by the territorial government. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, and their judgment, which had once isolated both Maylin and Jedediah, slowly, quietly reversed itself. They were no longer outcasts. They were simply part of the gulch. One cool evening, Jedediah sat on the small porch he had built, watching the last light paint the peaks in shades of orange and purple. Maylin came out and handed him a steaming mug of tea. She wore a dress of warm brown wool, the color of his mended coat, which now hung on a peg just inside the door. He could see the seam she had stitched, a dark, strong line that was now an inseparable part of the garment. It was a scar, but it was a scar that had healed stronger than the original hide. He looked from the coat to her face, seeing the same quiet strength in both. He had built his life like a fortress, designed to keep everyone out. He had believed that solitude was strength, that connection was a weakness to be avoided. But the cold had found a crack in his defenses, a tear he couldn't mend on his own. He found himself trusting her before he had ever decided to. It hadn't been a choice so much as a slow, steady realization, like the turning of a season. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was comfortable, filled with an understanding that needed no words. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers where it rested on the porch rail. She didn't pull away. Her fingers curled slightly, a small, warm presence against his. A man can spend a lifetime building walls to protect himself from the world, but he eventually learns that a fortress is also a prison, and that true strength isn't about keeping people out, but about finding the one person you are willing to let in.